It's Berlin briefing time, and we're asking whether Germany and Europe can afford to stand up to Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Why? Because on the 19th of March, Erdogan had his most promising political challenger arrested. While sitting in prison, Ekrem Imamoglu, the mayor of Istanbul, was elected the presidential candidate of the opposition CHP party for the 2028 election. Tens of thousands of people have taken to the streets since. Some 1,400 people were arrested, quite a few journalists. Most of them were released, but many others have been in prison for years. And we're about to brief you up on why this is happening right now, whether this is a sign of strength or weakness of President Erdogan. Europe relies on very heavily over defence and migration, and plainly whether Germany and Europe can afford to do more than verbally condemn civil rights breaches in Turkey right now. As we dive in, do drop us your comments, what you think. Here in the studio, I can now talk, first of all, down the line with Marc Pierini. He's a senior fellow at Carnegie Europe in Brussels. Amongst other things, he's a former EU ambassador to Turkey between 2006 and 2011. And Can Merey is with me. He's the lead investigative reporter for Germany's R&D news service, also a former Turkey correspondent who's visited many crisis regions in the world. And Can, I will start with you. Why are we seeing this happen right now? Why is Erdogan doing this?
Well, I think Erdogan pretty much felt threatened by Imamoglu's popularity. If you look at the latest polls before the arrests, it seemed highly likely that if it came to an election between the two, Imamoglu would actually win. Also, as far as the Turkish constitution is concerned, Erdogan cannot really wait until 2028 with the elections, because when the new constitution that was accepted by referendum in 2017, that was initiated by Erdogan, it says that the president can only serve for 2 terms. 2028, the second term would be finished, but his AKP, his party, built in a backdoor, saying if the parliament dissolves before 2028, then the president can be a candidate for a 3rd term. So, and since it's pretty probable that Erdogan is not going to give up power and is not going to be willing to give up power, he has to have these elections before.
2017, of course, also the year when Germany had concluded withdrawing its own military from a Turkish airbase over a dispute because Erdogan wouldn't allow German MPs to visit their own troops. So there have been question marks over how solid the commitment to democracy is for a very long time. At the same time, relations have been tense. Of course, also Erdogan came to the rescue for Europe in 2016 when he signed that migration deal. So against the backdrop of that, let's just listen to the reaction of Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the EU Commission, on this arrest.
The arrest of the mayor is deeply concerning. As a Council of Europe member that Turkey is and an EU candidate country, Turkey must uphold the democratic values, especially the rights of elected officials. So we want Turkey to remain anchored to Europe, but this requires a clear commitment to democratic norms and practices, and it is key that Turkey respects these fundamental principles.
Yes, and with that, Marc, I would like to throw it to you. Or else, that's the bit that we didn't hear from Ursula von der Leyen. Why is Europe not applying pressure right now?
Well, very, very simple. Most of Europe, perhaps with the exception of the German foreign minister, is on mute, simply because we have what is called the coalition of the willing between Western European countries. That includes Turkey. Turkey has participated with the foreign minister, with the chief of military staff, to the meetings of this coalition in the past few weeks. There is another meeting going on in Paris. So the asset that Erdogan has in his pocket is very simple. He has a very dynamic and innovative defense industry, probably more flexible than the similar industry in Western Europe, capable of ramping up production with artillery shells, artillery, infantry, vehicle, drones, of course, and so on. And therefore, he knows that there is a need, and therefore he hopes to be part of the coalition, to be providing a substantial segment of European defense, and for that price, have people in Western Europe keep silent on rule of law in Turkey.
So, Marc, you went straight for that coalition of the willing to help Ukraine as it fends off that war of aggression by Russia. And as we look at this coalition of the willing, what part is Turkey hoping to play? After all, it has the second largest army within the NATO context. So that brings me back to the initial question. Is this a sign of strength, you think, by Erdogan, who feels he can afford to do this right now? Or is he domestically so much under pressure? Because we didn't just see students demonstrating here. We saw people from all walks of life, didn't we?
Yeah, indeed. First of all, an incidental remark. Turkey has the second conventional army, that is by number of troops, number of planes, and number of tanks. If you consider nuclear force from the UK and France, Turkey is the fourth largest force in NATO, but never mind. The main strength of Turkey right now is that there is a need to come up to much higher levels of equipment in Ukraine and around Ukraine. This is because we're facing a brutal aggression from Russia in Ukraine and possibly in European states as well, NATO members, be it Romania or Poland or the Baltic states. Therefore, we need that. My problem with this approach is simply that you have one, a moral issue, and two, a strategic issue. The moral issue is that the coalition of the willing is essentially rule of law against brute force. You have a country, Russia, which is a dictatorship, and trying to annex part or the totality of Ukraine, and you have Western European countries abiding by rule of law as their founding principle. You normally have the US as well, but forget about the US for the moment. They've joined the camp of brute force, as we see every day in the trade field or defense field or Greenland or what. So there is an issue here of whose side are you on? Secondly, strategic issue. If tomorrow meaning the next 4 years, 3 years, whatever the agreement would be among the coalition parties, Western Europe decides to entrust Turkey with the supply of decisive weaponry for the coalition, maybe dispatching troops in Ukraine or any modality, you are doing it with a country which currently, Turkey, has a very strong economic and defense relationship with Russia. 50% of the gas used in Turkey comes from Russia. 7 to 8 million Russian tourists come every year to Turkey. Agricultural exports toward Russia, construction contract, you name it. And this is not a researcher's fantasy. It has happened in the past few years for completely different reasons, of course, but the Kremlin is able to stop overnight the flow of tourists to Antalya. They are able to stop overnight the flow of agricultural produce from Turkey. So in one word, Russia has the means to retaliate against Turkey if we don't like it. So this is our second problem in terms of who the coalition is teaming up with.
And of course, that also explains in parts why Turkey has continuously played such an important role in getting any kind of concessions to get grain out of Ukraine and delivered to world markets, because Turkey has relations all around. And it also has a very special relationship towards Germany. Many Turkish people came as workers in the 60s and 70s to Germany and stayed. So there's a huge Turkish constituency. And against the backdrop of that, I just want to listen to what Olaf Scholz, the still chancellor here in Germany, had to say.
In recent years, we have endeavored to further improve relations between Europe and Turkey. That is why the arrest of such a key opposition politician and the mayor of Istanbul is a very, very bad sign. It is a bad sign for democracy in Turkey, but it is certainly also a bad sign for relations between Europe and Turkey. We can only call for an immediate end to this and for the opposition and the government to compete with each other, rather than the opposition being put on trial.
So, Can, we keep getting a lot of political diagnostics there from European leaders. What do you make of that message by Olaf Scholz? How carefully worded is that?
Well, I think it was very carefully worded. And as Mark said, I think Europe cannot afford to alienate Erdogan at the moment, which obviously is bad news for the demonstrators in Turkey. Of course, Europe would have the means to take action to, the accession process could be, which is on ice now, could just simply be stopped.
Has been for a very long time, yes.
For a very long time, but it could be stopped, of course. Turkey could lose the candidate status, and you shouldn't forget that Erdogan, in I think 2004, was voted as the European of the Year here in Berlin. Then Chancellor Schröder held the speech, and it was Erdogan's probably one of his biggest successes in early years that he managed to set Turkey on the path towards Europe. Of course, then you had Merkel, you had France at that time that tried to block Turkey to really become a member. So you can probably discuss whether this keeping Turkey out radicalized Erdogan, or whether his radicalization prevented Turkey to ever joining the EU. But as a matter of fact, I think what Olaf Scholz also said, that there's certainly a special relationship between Turkey and Germany, but that's not always on a positive side. My own father, he's from Istanbul. He came to Germany actually before most of the guest workers came. He came to study here. But so for my personal history, I had many years I had discussions with him why he turned out to be an Erdogan supporter, while here in Germany he's the most liberal Turk you could imagine. And he once said a sentence that gave me a lot of food for thought. He said, "Erdogan gave me back my pride," and I hear that from a lot of Turks in Germany that even if they don't support Erdogan, but they said what he did, we can be proud to be Turks again, because they felt as second-class citizens. Many of them still feel up to today as second-class citizens. You have all these statistics, how much more difficult it is with a Turkish name to get an apartment, to get a job, and so on. So there is a discrimination that's still happening. The word guest workers that was used for Turks and Italians and others who came, implied that these people would return. So there was never any real effort to integrate them. They also didn't take any real efforts to integrate themselves, because they were also counting on returning to Turkey. At the end of the day, it didn't happen. So we have now, I think, around 3 million people with Turkish background here. And integration, even now, is still a huge issue. As you can see, when you see the election results for the Turkey elections, the Turks in Germany show stronger support for Erdogan than the Turks in Turkey do.
Yeah, that really is quite fascinating, and it points to a lot of failures on Germany's side for integration. Against the backdrop of this, Angela Merkel in 2015, 2016, when more than 1 million migrants and refugees came from Syria, suddenly needed Turkey and needed Erdogan, and she negotiated this migration deal. And fast forward to last year, Ursula von der Leyen went back, gave Erdogan promised another €1 billion to keep those some 3 million migrants from Syria in Turkey. So he was a gatekeeper for migration over the past decade. And now he still didn't get what he wanted, though. It was these the easing of visa restrictions.
Yeah, he was a gatekeeper that threatened to open the gates,
yes.
Right? And that, of course, is something very, like what Mark said, of course, is very true, that Europe needs him in terms of defense, needs Turkey, Erdogan in terms of defense, and in this very volatile global situation at the moment that we find ourselves in. But also the migration issue, of course, is a huge issue. As you can see in Germany, the last elections where the far right, AfD, became the second strongest party, first time in in history that we have a right extreme party, partly right extreme party, being so strong. And of course, I mean, if Erdogan would open up the gates, most of these refugees, I would assume, want to come to Germany, like most Syrians did all the time. And it would be a huge problem for the whole Balkan route, where they would traverse through Greece and then eventually Austria, Germany. And I think no German government, not the outgoing one or the future one, can afford this. So they are very much dependent on Erdogan. Additionally, I mean, you also had, when you still had a functioning democracy in the United States before Trump, there was criticism that came from there also. I mean, and of course, Washington is very powerful. And now we entered an age of autocracy where autocrats among themselves obviously deal with each other, Putin with Trump, and Erdogan is shows the same disdain for some democratic rules that we here still consider to be valid.
And this is an interesting point because Ursula von der Leyen also mentioned the Council of Europe. That is the organization which has its own human rights court as well, which includes Turkey. It doesn't just extend to the European Union. There are several journalists held in violation of rulings by that Court of Human Rights. They continue to remain in prison. And you mentioned that Germany is in transition to the next government. So I had the chance to speak to Jürgen Hart, who's a foreign policy politician of the conservative CDU-CSU, formerly known as Angela Merkel's party, which will most likely be the party of the likely next Chancellor, Friedrich Merz. Let's just take a listen what his response was.
I think we should trust on the Turkish civil society and the democratic and political process to solve that challenge. Talks with Turkey under these circumstances might be very difficult. We have some common objectives, we have some common challenges, especially in security issues. But Turkey, which weakens itself, is not helpful in looking to the economy and looking to the development of the Turkish currency. I fear that Turkey is weakening itself and therefore also weakening its position in international structures like NATO.
Mark, how does this sound for you? Will the potential next German government and Europe as a whole want to leave it to the markets to fix it, just as the markets are now applying pressure on Donald Trump in the US?
Well, first of all, why is Erdogan very popular? There is indeed an issue of restoring pride. This has just been said, and it's very true. It's also an issue of modernization. In my time, my 5 years in Ankara, from the end of 2006 to the end of 2011, I saw a complete transformation of the landscape. Airports, roads, tunnels, hospitals, and so on. So people were very much aware that with a good functioning economy, Erdogan was going to change their daily life. That was the thing. But now we have a different generation. People have seen how in the past more than 10 years, 12 years now, after the Gezi protest, gradually the media were put under control, the judges will be put under control, the military, of course, is out of politics, and then politicians started being attacked on various reasons and so on. Even the business people, Tusiad leaders a few weeks ago got into trouble for having just criticized Erdogan's policy. So basically what you're seeing here is a listing of grievances from the leadership in Ankara against the real and the first, perhaps, forceful leader of the opposition, Imamoglu. And this list is exactly the list of grievances Erdogan was faced with during his 22 years in power as prime minister and then president. Your diploma is fake, your tenders are rigged, your vote counting is not regular, etc., etc. You've talked to the Kurds, which Erdogan started a few years ago and has started again now. So why do it yourself and blame your opponents to do the same? So what you're faced with here is a president who's gone increasingly authoritarian, a constitution that is, the 2017 constitution, is installing a one-man rule system, and he's now the prisoner of this system. He cannot accept that suddenly someone from the opposition would take over. So you have now Imamoglu in jail, who's likely to be condemned for a few things, cannot probably run, and God knows what we're seeing next. Maybe there is an administrator ruling the Istanbul municipality. Maybe the party itself, CHP, is going to be dissolved. Judges have done that to the AKP before. They tried and they failed. So, it's a sort of not only mirror image of everything that has happened against Erdogan in the last 22 years, but it's perhaps some sort of revenge. And we do not see at the moment the way out of this.
Yeah, we'll take a look at that right now. But before we dive deeper into this, I just want to ask all of you out there if there are any specific issues you would want a Berlin briefing on. We've done a couple, particularly on relations with the United States, so we'll drop those links below. But let's dive deeper into the question, Cem. Who are the alternatives out there? What has Imamoglu done, first of all, to spark this furious reaction right now? And who else is out there? How much of an opposition is there left if Erdogan manages to keep him out of the political race for the next presidency?
Well, that is a good question, of course. But if you look back at the history of the past elections, even when Erdogan did not go as far as to jail his opponents, there was always a lot of hope on the side of the opposition that now finally the era of Erdogan is coming to an end. And at the end of the day, the opposition always failed. They had a chance in the 2015 elections when actually AKP did not end up having a majority, but the opposition couldn't agree on a coalition. And so at the end of the day, Erdogan repeated the elections, and then the AKP was the strongest party once more. So honestly, I see the protests now. And I was there during the Gezi protests. I think I read something by a political scientist, which I thought was pretty accurate, where he said that in 2013 the what was fueling the protests was hope, and what's fueling the protests now is despair, because as Marc said, the economic situation is pretty dire, and what in 2013 was still a democracy, more or less. It's become much more autocratic, much more repressive in the last couple of years. And I honestly don't see anyone like, Imamoglu was, first of all, on AKP side, Erdogan has no obvious successor. He never let anyone really grow that far that he could be a competitor at the end of the day. So, he's been ruling Turkey as a prime minister or as a president for the last 22 years. So these students that are on the streets don't know anything else than the system Erdogan. And I don't know. Many times during the Gezi protests, different scandals, corruptions, and what have you. There was, of course, the coup attempt in 2016. So often I heard people say this is the end of Erdogan. It turned out, he's a very talented politician, a very talented survivor, I have to say. It never was the end. He became more and more powerful, and now he's, with the constitution, with the presidential system that he initiated, he is probably the most powerful Turk since Ataturk, since many decades, certainly. And it's very hard to say what would happen then. I don't know. The leader of the CHP, he became a pretty prominent voice during the protests now. But at the end of the day, the CHP never managed to field a candidate that actually that really threatened Erdogan. Last time, of course, with Kılıçdaroğlu, he at least managed to force Erdogan into a runoff. Yeah. But apart from that, I've never really seen Erdogan's rule threatened.
So the question I have to you, Marc, is can Europe have a real interest in any change in Ankara? Or does it need that kind of stability while at the same time criticizing Erdogan on his way to a more authoritarian take of his presidency?
Well, in my view, first of all, there is no doubt that Erdogan will cling to power. He is, after all, a champion survivor, if you look at the past 22 years. So there is no reason for him to change course. Where I think there is a miscalculation on the part of Turkey is simply that the reinforcement of the European defense architecture, for which Western Europe needs Turkey indeed, cannot be done politically at the price of giving a giant role to an autocrat. And that is linked to the essence of the battle that Western Europe is currently waging with both Putin and Trump, because don't forget, we have enmity from Washington. And it's revealed, I mean, it's just not the 25% additional taxes yesterday on cars, but it's the statements of J.D. Vance in Munich and more recently in this Signalgate scandal. So we see that the political alliance between Western Europe and the United States is not there anymore. There is rather a sort of alliance between Washington and Moscow on many grounds. So the issue is really, as I said earlier, that this is a battle between brute force and rule of law. And rule of law is essential for European countries, whether we like it or not. So maybe the only way out, because of course Western Europeans are, except if they are of Turkish origin, we're not voting in Turkey. So the only way out is to keep the president at arm's length, not give him a podium in the summits, whereby he would claim that he has managed to quell European voice on rule of law. That is not a price, I think, that our population in Western Europe is ready to pay.
Tim, do you believe that that will actually work towards Erdogan, for instance, on the issue of the easing of visa requirements, dropping visas altogether? Erdogan keeps getting promises from the European Union, but they keep getting pushed into the future.
But it's a dilemma, of course. I mean, if you ease the visa restrictions, it makes you look like you're rewarding his autocratic tendencies. So it's really a catch-22 that I find very hard to answer. I mean, I personally am in favor of easing the visa restrictions because I think getting people to travel to Europe is a good thing for us also, and for them, obviously. But of course, the first thing that would happen, especially with the visa easing of the visa regime, would be that Erdogan would claim this is his success, and this is, of course, something that I find very difficult to grant him in times like these, when he's when he's suppressing the opposition, when he is suppressing protests, when he is suppressing the rule of law.
So I want to conclude, Marc, by asking both of you, again, our underpinning question, and please give me a one-sentence answer. Can Europe afford to push back against Erdogan at this moment in time?
Well, first of all, there is a mutual interest in not only defense industry joining forces, but also in simply investment and trade. We've seen in the past few days, Turkey has lost $30 billion defending the lira because investors are worried about autocracy. So there is a Turkish interest to be careful on the extent to which they want to reinforce autocracy. For the rest, it's as I said before, an issue of dignity for European countries. Maybe there is a way to carry on with the cooperation on the defense industry or troop deployment or what, at technical level without giving a political blessing from the whole of Western Europe, not just the EU, but also the UK, Norway, maybe Canada as well, or a blessing on his autocratic policies. That would be a killer for Europe, not just a moral defeat. It would be a killer for Europe because it will reinforce the Viktor Orbáns of Europe, and there are many of them waiting in political parties.
Jim, what's your expectation? Will the next likely chancellor push back against an increasingly authoritarian Erdogan?
Well, I'm certain he's going to do that verbally. I'm not so certain it's going to be any action that's going to be taken. And I also think it's probably very difficult in these times for Europe to take decisive actions against Erdogan. But having said that, I don't think that means that Western Europe just has to accept what's happening there. I mean, it's still a EU candidate country. And if you remember, during the time when Deniz Yücel, our colleague, was jailed in Turkey, when the German then Foreign Minister Sigmar Gabriel said, we will ask German companies, or we will tell German companies to be really careful to invest in Turkey because it's a dangerous country to do that. Suddenly, Turkey was up in arms. The Erdogan government was up in arms because we shouldn't forget, economically, the economy is Erdogan's weak spot, especially at the moment. The inflation is around 40%. Prices are skyrocketing. People are really, really frustrated. And he cannot afford economically to have an escalating conflict with Europe. And I think this is probably something which should be explored more.
And with that, we've got you briefed up on that crackdown by Turkish President Erdogan on his key rival Ekrem Imamoglu of the opposition CHP party in Turkey. Tell us what you make of it in the comments below, and feel free to let us know what you would like a Berlin briefing on. Also, look at our Berlin briefing weekly newsletter that's coming out, and do tune in again. Thank you very much.